Something that really fascinates me is when I'm reading about a certain theological problem and there's actually there's disagreement even among the Thomists, within the Thomistic tradition or between different scholastic schools. I think it actually provide insight into many of the other theological problems we have. One of these famous areas where the Thomists disagree and you see interestingly enough, a significant departure in the modern era is on this question of what constitutes the divine nature. A lot of individuals are either, on the one hand, simply disagreeing with the majority of the previous tradition, or on the other hand, a lot of them are misinterpreting the previous tradition. Sometimes they're both disagreeing with and misinterpreting the previous tradition. So this ends up being one of my favorite problems to cover. The last two, we went over introduction to theology as a science. We went over existence of God and the question of atheism. We went over those in the last 3 episodes. And now we're going to be covering Billowart's treatment of the divine nature. What constitutes the divine nature? This may seem like a very complicated question, but it's actually quite simple, especially when you compare the question of what constitutes the divine nature to questions of what constitutes human nature, for example. And for those of you who are watching the YouTube video, if you go on Patreon, you can get the rest of the episodes if you're a 25 or up patron, or you can get the full course and buy the full course on my website, christianbwagner.com. But anyways, let's get right into the text. I'm going to be sharing my screen here. Here we go. That should pop up. So this is from around pages 23 to 29 of the first volume on the metaphysical essence of God. Because before we go into doctrine of God, and before we go in and discuss all of the different attributes of God, the operations of God, and so on and so forth, we have 2 questions to answer. Because when we look at, for example, man, we can consider a lot of different predications that we can make of man. And if any of you guys have read Porphyry, read about the predicables, you're going to be very familiar with this. Because we can very easily ask, when it comes to man, about, what are the different attributes that I have, such as the different accidents that I have. I'm white, I'm so-and-so, tall, I'm from this area, I'm doing this right now. We can predicate those different things of man. We can also predicate, for example, that I am an animal. That's the genus that I am in. We can think about me as a created creature, created being. We can think about that. And that createdness and created being, finite being, is something that permeates all of my different attributes. We can think about what is most proper to my species. We can think about rationality in that way. We can think about what my essence is, which is going to be rational animality, and so on and so forth. And in the same way, when it comes to God, we can think about all of the different things that we predicate of God. So we can say God is holy, God is loving, God is just, and so on and so forth. We can make all of these different predications of God, but we can also ask certain questions about the order between those predications in our understanding of God. So in a similar way as we can ask, okay, what is the specific difference of humanity? What specifies man from other animals? What is that most particular predication to man that becomes the root of all of his other unique attributes, such as being political, being able to speak, having risibility, being able to laugh, all of those different attributes. What is that unique root of all of those attributes, all of those different perfections known as properties, and what is something that distinguishes him from all creatures? Well, this is going to be for man his rationality, his rational animality. This is what is going to be unique to man. So when it comes to God, we can ask similar questions. We're going to be able to ask different forms of this question, as we'll see. And there's going to be certain individuals who, when they're asking these questions, are going to ask these questions wrongly. So we have to be very, very precise about what we're asking. And in the history of this doctrine, we actually have a strong consensus in the Baroque period. So for those who don't know, the Baroque period is from the mid to late-ish 16th century to about the early 18th century, if you want to think about it like that. About 1750 ends up being the cutoff date for a lot of people. There's a very solid consensus, at least in the early part of that period, and then there's some disagreement. And then when it comes to the modern era, so post Leo the 13th Thomism, post Vatican I to Vatican II Thomism, there's actually a different consensus on this point. And they look back, and in some cases, they misinterpret the tradition on this point of metaphysical essence. So this is a very, in a way, complicated question, but it becomes quite simple if we keep the categories properly in our minds. So let's begin. What constitutes the divine nature? This is not a question about what physically, and notice physically, it's basically in reference to, you think about like naturally. Physically constitutes the divine nature as it really is in itself, in se. So this basically means is all of those different attributes that goes into forming something. So when it comes to man, if you think about what physically constitutes man, all of my different properties would be included in that, political, language, risibility, all that different stuff, and then also the different attributes that I may have of all different sorts. That is contained under what physically constitutes something. So we think about what physically constitutes the divine nature. That's obviously going to be all of the different perfections that constitute God, put into one. That is what physically constitutes God in himself. But when it comes to what metaphysically constitutes God, as we'll see, that is a lot more concerned with the order between those attributes, and those attributes not as they are in themselves, but as they are considered by us. So the physical essence to God, what physically constitutes God, that is something which is outside of the reach of our intellects in our current state. It says, "For it is certain that all perfections, whether absolute or relative, really constitute God, since they are all identified in the very nature of God, which in itself is most simple. Nor is it a question about the divine nature taken in a broad and extensive signification as the uncreated being, which is distinguished from creatures, and which is taken transcendentally, found in all attributes, in the proportional manner in which the ratio of created being is imbibed in all the differences in mode of creatures." This is where it starts to get a little bit confusing. What the heck does he mean by this? What he means by this is that divine nature can be taken in a broad and extensive signification. And all this means is what is common between all of those different attributes. What is common between all of them? Obviously, what is common between all of the attributes of God is the ratio of uncreated being. We think about it as the ratio of aseity. That's what that's what is contained in all of the different attributes of God. In the same way, what is similar between me, this white Monster can, this glass of water, this pen, the whatever. What is common between all of us? What transcends all of these things? Well, it's created being. Created being is what transcends all of these different things. So that's not what we're asking about. And actually, on this point about the divine nature in a broad and extensive signification, everybody agrees on this point. There's not any, to my knowledge, there's not any sort of disagreement on this at all. Now, continuing, but the question is about the nature or essence strictly taken as that which is first conceived in God. Notice that which is first conceived in God isn't in reference to that which we first know in God. No. That's not what is considered, but rather that which has the primacy in God. That's what that which is first conceived. That which has the primacy in God as the source and origin of other properties. So when it comes to this, like for example, in man, the fact that we have rational animality, that is a root, that is a source and origin of all of our properties, of our risibility, of us as political animals, as us as animals who can talk and communicate and things like that. That is, our rational animality is the source and origin of the other properties. They have, in our order of knowing, an order among themselves. So when it comes to God, we're asking, what is that first conceived? What is that which is the source and origin of all of the other properties in God, all of those other attributes in God? What is that fount of the other attributes in God? From which it is therefore virtually distinguished. So this is the next clause, from which it is therefore virtually distinguished. So we can't have it as something which is, if you remember, actually, no, we're going to talk about this below, so I guess I'll introduce this ahead of time. The distinction between the distinction between a attribute which is distinguished by reason reasoned and by reason reasoning. By reason reasoned, that is simply something which has a foundation in the thing. They're different ideas. Whereas reason reasoning, this is what we know as a nominal distinction. It's distinct by mere name. So there's not a distinction of reason reasoning, of reason reasoned, for example. There's not a virtual distinction. I'll use virtual and nominal because that's a little bit clearer. There's not a virtual distinction in God because there's no foundation for this distinction between God's faculty of his will and willing, or God's faculty of his intellect and intellection. That is merely something that comes from the potentiality of creatures. So that's only a way of speaking when it comes to God. It's by our mode or manner of speaking. So when it comes to the metaphysical constituent of the divine nature, it is that root which is virtually distinguished between all of the other attributes. So this is different than, for example, up here, the divine nature taken in a broad and extensive signification. That's completely different. And why is that different? Well, the reason that it's different is because uncreated being is not something which is virtually distinguished. It's not like a virtually distinct attribute separate from all the other attributes. It's not virtually distinguished from all of the other properties in God. It's something which transcends. It's something which is present in all of them. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay, good. And in which, under this ratio, it is not conceived as transcendentally included. So again, it's not something which is transcendentally present in all of the other attributes. That is about the metaphysical constituent, or essential difference of the divine nature, as imperfectly conceived by us travelers in this state, or wayfarers. I should translate that as wayfarers. As its essential difference and origin of other properties, of other perfections, as rationality in man. So when it comes to man, this is rationality. Rationality is that highest perfection. It perfects animality. It makes us what it is, and it's the root of all of those other perfections. So we're asking, in God, is there something akin to rationality in man? Obviously, as imperfectly conceived by us wayfarers. This is assuming that it's us conceiving it. So, first, the first conclusion in this, there's going to be two conclusions. The first conclusion, the nature or essence of God is not metaphysically constituted by aseity. And the second one is going to be the divine act of intellection, not as something radical, but as something actual, under the ratio of the ultimate actuality subsisting in itself, constitutes the metaphysical nature of God. Hence, the description of God will be this: a being supremely and most actually understanding. Okay, so that's a little complicated. Again, when I get there, I'll explain it. But those are the two conclusions that we have within this article. I like to go over both of the conclusions beforehand. First one's a negative. It's negating the, quote, common opinion, although this is not really the common opinion. It's negating the, quote, common opinion, and it's something which is, in the second conclusion, affirming the correct opinion. Okay, so the nature or essence of God is not metaphysically constituted by aseity. So the first proof is going to be the fundamental reason. That which is the formal constituent of the divine nature must distinguish it not only from creatures, but also from attributes, persons, and other divine formalities. But the ratio of entis ase, so being of itself, or aseity, does not achieve this distinction, therefore, etc. So right here, the first argument is, we already went over here above, as a point of definition, that there needs to be this virtual distinction between that root perfection and the other perfections, the other properties. And it can't be transcendentally included. So it can't be something that transcends all of the other properties and relations and so on and so forth. It can't be transcendentally included in that way. There must be this virtual distinction present. Just like in creatures, we can't have created being as our perfection because it's transcendentally included in all of the different modes of creatures. That wouldn't make any sense. It has to be virtually distinguished and as a root of the other perfections. So when it comes to aseity, when it comes to the fact that God is uncreated being, we think about it like that, that can't really be that which is the root of all the other perfections. It's not how it works. The major premise, and this actually, interestingly enough, there's another position which this excludes as well, which is the Scotist position. The Scotist position, and we're going to get into this in a little bit, the Scotist position is something which posits that infinity is this root perfection that formally constitutes the divine nature. And it can't be this, and the reason that it can't be this is because, well, God's justice is infinite, God's goodness is infinite, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is something which is transcendental. It transcends all of the different attributes in God. We can look at other things like the fact that infinity is something which is negative, but those are kind of secondary arguments because the Scotists are going to say that, and some actually Thomists, to my understanding, are going to say that infinity is actually a positive perfection as well. So this is the best argument against it. And this is the fundamental reason, and it's going to exclude basically all of the other options that are given. Okay, so the major premise, so this is the major premise right here. That which is the formal constituent of the divine nature must distinguish it not only from creatures, but also from attributes, persons, and other divine formalities. So this is the proof of the major premise. The major premise is clear because, as mentioned, this is not about the divine nature broadly taken as the uncreated entity, the ratio under which it is distinguished from creatures, but it's strictly taken as the root of divine attributes, and hence virtually distinct from them. So when it comes to, and this actually adds a little bit more information for us that's helpful. So when it comes to the divine nature broadly taken, if we want to consider, God as divine nature broadly taken, sure, it's going to be aseity in this point. But this is divine nature broadly taken is not only that which transcends all of the different attributes in God, but it's also going to be that which distinguishes God from creatures. So that's pretty interesting. It distinguishes God from creatures. That's going to be the divine nature broadly taken. Okay, then the minor premise is proven. So remember the minor premise, but the ratio of entis ase does not achieve this distinction. So here's the proof of the minor premise. The ratio of entis ase, in its formal ratio, is a transcendent predicate of all divine formalities or perfections, and is formally imbibed in them. But such a predicate does not distinguish nature from attributes, therefore, etc. So when it comes to the fact that God is entis ase, this is present throughout all of the attributes of God. I mean, it's something, again, if we wanted to talk about the relations, I mean, the Son and the Spirit, entis ase, the Father, entis ase, his goodness, justice, infinitude, whatever you want to say, this is going to be present in all of them, in the formal ratio of all of them. Now, there's said to be a minor virtual distinction, which we'll get into in the next episode. So technically, they're contained as implicit and explicit, but it's not contained in the formal ratio of the other. Hence, they are virtually distinguished. But entis ase is not virtually distinguished from any of the other attributes. That makes sense? Okay, I hope it makes sense. Okay, so, and then the major premise is clear. For everything in God is ans ase. So yeah, major premise, very clear. And then minor premise is also clear because nature and property are not distinguished by what they agree upon and what is formally found in all of them. And then this reason also militates against the opinion of Scotus, because infinity in which he places the divine essence is also a transcendent predicate. So I mentioned that earlier. Okay, so now we're going to get to an objection. And this objection's fun because it might be, for those of you who are a little bit more in tune with kind of what's going on here, you're going to be able to understand why this objection doesn't work very quickly. And it's kind of a funny response, actually. So to this fundamental reason, the adversaries commonly respond first by stating that esse ase can be taken in three ways. So first, the negation of being from another as from a real cause with dependence. And thus they say whatever is in God is ans ase. So with this one, there's no being from another with real cause with dependence. Okay, so that's obviously everything. Okay, you're right, guys, you're right. With the first one. With the second one, the negation of being from another as from a formal principle without dependence. and thus the eternal Father is Anza Se, but not the Son and the Holy Spirit. So in the second sense, this is referring to the Father in his inashability. Okay, so, and the fact that the Son and the Holy Spirit are from another as from a formal principle without dependence. So this is a Trinitarian reflection. And then the third one, this is the one where they're going to affirm it as the negation of being from another as from a virtual cause or root. And this applies solely to the divine essence. Thus, they admit that aseity in the first sense does not constitute the divine nature, because in that sense it is transcendent to all attributes, nor even in the second sense, because otherwise the Son and the Holy Spirit, as such, would not have the divine nature, since they have being from the Father as from a principle. Therefore, only aseity in the third sense is the constitutive of the divine nature, and in that sense it is not transcendent to the attributes, but the root of them. Well, what we're going to see is that basically what they do is, it's kind of funny, they turn Anza Se in the third sense, the negation of being from another is just, that's just the opposite of ase from yourself. The negation of being from another in the third sense, they basically just map onto the definition of what it means to be the divine nature taken in a strict sense. So, I mean, they kind of just jump the gun here and just define a third sense of Anza Se that nobody else defines it as, and they happen to define it in the same way that the divine nature is defined as. So it begs the question. This is the point. So now the reply to this, and he's going to say basically what I said. This response clearly begs the question and assumes or does not address what is in question. Therefore, it is null. So it's basically saying, well, Anza Se means it is the root of others that's virtually distinguished from it. And then we could just ask, well, and what is that? They say, well, it's Anza Se. It's, well, how are you defining Anza Se? Well, it's that which is virtually distinguished from others and the root of all perfections. Well, that's the question in the first place, isn't it? So you just really have to ask, well, what is that then? And then they're gonna very clearly go in a quite perfect circle. So rather, we have to just ask, okay, well, what is that perfection then under that definition of being Anza? Say, well, what is that perfection? And we're gonna say, well, that perfection is divine intellection in second act, as we'll get into. But he's gonna prove the antecedent, which, if you remember, this is called an enthymeme. So an enthymeme is a syllogism where the minor premise is not stated. It's an assumed or subsumed minor premise. So this is just the antecedent right there, that premise, and this is the consequent right there. But anyways, the antecedent is this response clearly begs the question, assumes or does not address what is in question. So proof of the antecedent. Aseity in the third sense, that is, not being from another as from a root, or rather being the root of others, they say, constitutes the divine nature. But this is not what is being questioned, for everyone agrees on this. Rather, it is questioned to which formality or notion in God this belongs. That it is not from another as from a root, but is rather the root of others, which this response of the adversaries in no way proves or shows, since they admit it is not aseity in the first or second sense, therefore, etc. So again, basically what I just said. This is the question we're asking in the first place. Nobody disagrees on this. We're just asking which perfection is this applicable to. That's the question that we're asking. So they kind of dodge it in a very shady way. Okay, so confirmation and explanation. To say that not being from another as from a root, but being the root of others constitutes nature, and conversely, that being from another as from a root constitutes properties, is to prove what nature and properties are in general. So boom, this is just the definition of nature versus properties. Nature is the root from which properties flow, and properties are those things which flow from nature. That's just the definition of the terms. So for example, when we think about man, my rationality is going to be that root of the other perfections. And the other perfections, those properties, such as risibility, being political, having speech, and so on and so forth, those are going to be properties which flow forth from the root. So they literally just said the definition of nature and the definition of properties, and said, well, that's how we're defining Anza Se. Well, it's okay. Well, you didn't really just answer the question in the first place. Okay. Not what they are in this particular case, namely in God, or to which formality in him they belong, which is what is being questioned here. Therefore, the same as before. And then proof of the major premise. Not being from another as from a root, but being the root of others, and likewise being from another as from a root, are definitions of nature and properties in general, which apply no more to God than to man or other creatures. So boom, you have it right here. I mean, by this definition, anzase would be the definition of what is the root of perfections in me. I mean, if you're defining it as that perfection, which is not from another perfection as from a formal principle, but is the formal principle of other perfections, in that case, my rationality would be anzase, which is absurd. That would absolutely make no sense. For I can say the same thing about human nature, but that it is what is not from another as from a root, but is rather the root of others, and about its property. That it is from another as from a root. But if it is asked what in man is not from another as from a root, but is the root of others, I will assign an answer that it is rationality. So, very, very important, very, very important right here, is that we're asking, okay, what is that formal principle right there? I mean, they're kind of janky with giving this as aseity, calling this that which is anzase. It's kind of janky. But if you just mean it in that third sense, with what they're saying, then yeah, by that standard, I mean, I guess you could call rationality in man anzase. But as I said, that's just an absurd use of language. So it doesn't make sense for them to distinguish between these three. They're just giving it in general. We're asking which perfection in particular has this notion. And in man, it's rationality. And this is what is now being asked about God and what the adversaries must assign in him. It is not, as we have said, and they admit, aseity in the first and second senses, nor as it is evident aseity in the third sense. Therefore, none of those assigned by the adversaries, and this reason for which I have not heard or seen a solution, has led me to this conclusion. Okay, so that's basically the explanation of it. Okay, so right here, second proof. Second proof right here. Second proof. God must be constituted by degree of intellection, therefore not by degree of being or entis ase. So it's saying God must be constituted by degree of intellection, not by degree of being. Okay, a grade of intellection versus a grade of being. And the proofs are going to highlight, okay, why is he comparing degree of intellection with degree of being? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Or degree of entity, however you want to say it. Okay, so first proof of the antecedent. Since God is the most perfect being, he must be constituted by the most perfect degree, or most perfect grade. But among the 4 degrees or 4 grades constituting nature, namely being, living, sensing, and intellection, the most perfect is the degree of intellection, therefore, etc. So we have these 4 degrees which constitute nature: being, living, sensing, and intellection. So being would be, it's something which is common to all things. This is actually like nature taken the extensive sense, if you really wanted to in this way. Being is common to me, to, this shotgun shell. I don't have no idea why I have a shotgun shell on my desk, but I do. By this pen, it's common amongst all of us. Living is common between me, a dog, a plant, microorganisms, other people. Those are common between all of us. Sensing, this is kind of the higher degree of sensing. It gets more elite, It's common between me, not the plants. The plants are not with sensing. Me, a dog, a cat, whatever. And then intellection is the height or the highest perfection. So with intellection, it's only men, angels, and God. That's the degree of intellection. It's the highest degree of perfection. So what it's saying is, well, with God, the root of all of his perfections is going to be the highest degree of perfection, and this is going to be intellection. Okay, and he gives a proof. This is the typical proof, but I have a little footnote here where I actually go over other proofs. So there's other proofs for this. For example, St. Thomas actually talks about this in his Lectio Romana. What else? The identity between the procession after mode of nature and procession after mode of intellection. The sun proceeds after mode of nature and generation. Sun also proceeds after mode of intellection. This is another proof. I add those below. If you wanna read the footnote, you can read the footnote, but I'll just give his argument, which is a motivation why you guys should be patrons and have access to all that stuff. If you're listening on YouTube, you gotta buy the course and get access to that footnote right there. You guys are gonna die if you don't read that footnote. You guys would be really sad if you didn't read that footnote. Okay. So the antecedent is proven by the doctrine of St. Thomas in Prima Pars, question 93, article 3. Among creatures, only angels and men are made in the image of God. That is, they participate in and imitate something of the nature of God, because they are intellectual. Therefore, the nature of God is constituted by the degree of intellection and not by the degree of being. Otherwise, all creatures would be made in the image of God. So this is interesting. St. Thomas proves this by saying, hey, there's only like a metaphorical way in which I could talk about a cup or a pen or a blade of grass as being in the image of God. There's only like a very remote sense in which I could talk about that. But properly speaking, when we talk about the image of God, we're talking about something present in angels and in men. Well, what is that present in angels and men? Well, it's that highest degree of perfection that we have, which is our intellectual natures. So this is what St. Thomas is going to argue. Okay, so now when it comes to the second conclusion. The divine act of intellection, not as something radical, i.e. in first act, but as something actual. Okay, right here. You may be very confused. Not as something radical, but as something actual. Well, radical, that comes from radix. That just means root, as the root. Not as something as the root, but as something actual. So in creatures, we have a distinction between first and second act. We have a distinction between our intellect, so our intellect as the sort of root of intellection, between the will and the root of willing, between power and act in general. We have this distinction between first and second act. But when it comes to God, God doesn't have this. So we can have, actually when it comes to root, we have a twofold root. We have, on the one part, the remote root, and on the other part, the proximate root. So this is technically called the principium quo. So there's the principium quo remotum, so that's the nature of the thing as the remote principle by which it acts. So that would be human nature in us. And we also have the principium quo proximum, so the proximate principle by which something acts. So that would be our various different faculties. So if I think by my intellect, or I taste by my tongue, or I see by my eyes, those are the principium quo proximum. Those are the proximate root of those acts, which are the faculties. Okay, does that make sense? So this is the divine act of intellection, not as something radical. So it's not as a sort of root or in first act, but as something actual. So it's the actual active, intellecting, if you may. Because in God, we only have a distinction of reasoning from the mode in which we experience things amongst creatures. There's not in God any sort of said to be fundamentum in re. There's not a foundation in the thing when it comes to God for considering a distinction between his intellect and intellection. There's only a purely nominal distinction that comes from our experience. Okay, so the divine act of intellection, not as something radical, but as something actual, under the ratio of the ultimate actuality subsisting in itself. So the ultimate actuality, intellect, ultimately actual, subsisting in itself, constitutes the metaphysical nature of God. Hence, the description of God will be like this: a being supremely and most actually understanding. So we say the intellection, that's the highest perfection in God. This is the metaphysical essence of God. This is the highest perfection, and it serves as the virtually distinct root for all of the other perfections in God. Now, this is where there's some disagreement. So when it comes to some of the Baroque Thomists, they have this weird view. And this weird view, it says, okay, well, we agree with the aseity as the divine nature taken in the broad sense. But they thought that the nature of God, so the nature is principle of operation, and the essence of God, or the entity of God, which is the principle of being, they thought these were virtually distinct from one another. So if they're virtually distinct from one another, what you have to have is and we see this actually in the addition, which is added in the end of this article. the Vivaeus editors actually misunderstood what was going on here and got it wrong. I still translated the section. I was going to be petty and just not translate it, but I translated it anyway, and I gave a little bit of a footnote to it. So if you want to read that, it's wrong. The addition at the end is wrong, by the way. So don't trust that, please. But they thought that the essence and the nature of God were virtually distinct from one another. So since they thought that these were virtually distinct from one another, they thought that there had to be a distinct root in the operative line, so in the line of operation, on the one hand, and a distinct root in the entitative line, so the line of being on the other hand. So they said, okay, well, we can have two different roots. So on the one hand, we have the root of anzase, that is the root in the entitative line. And on the other hand, we'll have the root of the operative line, which is divine intellection in second act. So they distinguish between these two. This is where we get the distinction. But the Thomists, they respond with basically the idea that there is no virtual distinction between nature and essence and God. And this comes down to a supreme actuality. There isn't a virtual distinction between these two. And therefore, the divine intellection can be immediately the root of all of the operative perfections and immediately the root of all of the entitative perfections insofar as it is pure act. So divine intellection in second act is the root of all of these perfections. If you want to read a good article, Fanatic Thomist, if you look up Fanatic Thomist, constituent of the divine nature or something of that, I link it somewhere. I link it in the footnote of one of these. So again, if you don't have access to the footnotes, you should get it. I have it linked in the footnote of this, and you can read that whole article. It's done by Astro. If you guys know Astro, it's absolutely fantastic. I remember I first read about this whole debate about two and a half years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And reading what Astro wrote, I was definitely put together a lot of things for me that I had been confused about beforehand. So it's an excellent article. But okay, what is the proof for this? According to what we've just said in the second proof of the previous conclusion, so right here, second proof of the antecedent, the divine nature is metaphysically constituted by the intellectual degree or intellectual grade. And since it is the purest act free from all potentiality, it must be constituted by what in that degree is most actual, lacks even a shadow of potentiality, but such as actual intellection, i.e. second act, and not radical intellection, i.e. first act, therefore, etc. So obviously it's not going to be the concept of radical intellection. That's not most perfect. Actuality is more perfect than potency. That's basically what's going on here. And then the proof of the minor premise. Either we speak of remote radical intellection, which is the immaterial substance itself. Okay, what is remote radical intellection? What the frick does that mean? Well, that means the sort of most remote root, which for us it's going to be like our root of our rationality is human nature. That's going to be what we talk about with the principium quo prox remotum. It's going to be that remote principle by which something acts. So that's going to be, if it's a radical intellection, it's the immaterial substance itself. Or a proximate radical intellection. So the proximate radical intellection is the faculty, which is the intellectual power. But both in our way of conceiving relate to actual intellection in the matter of potentiality to act. Remember, in our way of conceiving, or of first act to second act, therefore, etc. So obviously, intellection in second act is going to be more perfect than either remote radical intellection, which is the immaterial substance itself, which is the principium quo remotum, or of proximate radical intellection, which is going to be the principium quo proximum, right there. Either nature or faculty. These stand as potentiality to act, as first act to second act. So we can't have that going on. Okay. So that is constitutive of the nature of anything, not which is first conceived in it in any way. Otherwise, the ratio of substance in man would be constitutive of human nature. But what is first conceived in it as something more actual and more perfect. So I mentioned that earlier as like the sort of primacy, as that highest perfection, which is the perfective root of the others. It's that perfection which roots the other perfection. So it's not that which is first conceived in the sense of like from our perspective, but that which is first conceived in the thing as having primacy and as the root of other things. So that it's a clarity when it comes to that. whence it becomes the root and origin of other perfections. But among all the perfections of God, the first that is conceived as more actual and perfect is not radical understanding or the potentiality of understanding, but the most actual and most perfect understanding itself. Therefore, etc. And then continuing, we can go into the objection. I guess I'll just do the objection. Why not? I don't want to do the addition. And if you want to look at all the footnotes, you can, because the footnotes I add in some clarifying notes, which I'm basically kind of giving the substance of in here. But, it's fun to write these things down. Okay, so here's the objection that's given by a lot. Okay. Actual intellection is essentially an operation, but an operation does not constitute the nature of an operator, but presupposes it constitutes, therefore, etc. So this argument is basically like let's say if I said that my actual active rationality, so like me acting in a rational way, if I said that was my perfection, I'd look at you funny, because obviously my act right there presupposes an operator who acts. So that's the objection right there. I respond by distinguishing the minor premise. A finite operation, which is an accident, does not constitute the nature of the operator, but presupposes it constituted. I concede the minor premise. An infinite operation subsisting in itself, I deny the minor premise. So this is what clarifies right here, subsisting in itself. So it is the operation subsisting itself, intellection subsisting in itself. So it's not like, you can't think of it in terms of, and we'll get into this later, but you can't think of the intellection in God in the same terms as you think of intellection in us, which is going to be accidental. In God, it's subsisting, and it's really identical to himself. So the disparity is that it is of the nature of a finite operation, which is an accident superadded to the operator to proceed from the operator, and thus to presuppose it as constituted. But it is not the nature of an infinite operation subsisting in itself to proceed from the operator, but only to be its ultimate act identified with it without virtual distinction. It's very important there. Again, when it comes to first and second act, when it comes to the creature, you have a faculty, then you have the act which flows from it. That is an accident superadded to the thing. Okay. When it comes to God is always in second act. God doesn't move from potency to act when it comes to his faculties. So there isn't even a virtual distinction between the operator and operation. That's very important. Because in an infinite being, nothing can be conceived unless it remains pure act in our conception. It would not remain a pure act if the operating nature were conceived as distinct from its ultimate act, proceeding from it and under the ratio of the first act in relation to it. Therefore, operation as proceeding from a principle and under the ratio of from is not formally in God, which is well noted, but only eminently and virtually, inasmuch as the same entity in God eminently does everything that in created things, the preceding operation and the principle from which it proceeds do. Okay, that's, a mouthful right there. But basically, it's saying that there can be two types of ways in which something can be in God. It could be formally and eminently in God. Formally and eminently basically means that it contains in the notion a formal perfection, such as love, goodness, intellection in second act. All of these things contain certain perfections which can be formally attributed to God. But when it comes to when it comes to something virtually and eminently predicated of God, these things, they have a certain imperfection in their notion. So the distinction between a faculty and its act, that is something which predicates some sort of imperfection. So we have to speak about it in this way because this is just how we experience creatures. And, we experience, how you have a faculty, then that faculty operates, and then it stops operating, and it keeps operating. So we have this distinction between the two among creatures. So this is kind of the way in which we speak about God. God is an intellect, and God understands. Although technically in God there is no distinction whatsoever, not even a virtual distinction between intellect and intellecting. God's intellect is something which is purely actual. So that's what it's trying to get at there. And therefore it must be said that the divine nature is constituted by intellection, not under the notion of operation as proceeding, but under the concept of from, but under the notion of ultimate actuality subsisting in itself. So this clarifies this last point in the thesis, that it is ultimate actuality subsisting in itself, second actuality, not first actuality, and not as some sort of operation proceeding from God, but rather it is this ultimate intellection, second act subsisting in itself, that is the root and highest perfection of all of the perfections that flow forth from God. Okay, well, that was really fun. That was great. You know, I always love studying this. This is one of my favorite things. Again, if you are listening and you're on YouTube and you haven't yet, you should definitely consider either buying the course on christianbwagner.com/course. You get all of the course text, all of my translations of Bill of Art. It's eventually going to be like over 100 videos. It's going to be crazy, the amount of material that I put out. Or you could just become a patron at patreon.com/MiltonThomist. If you're at the 10 and above, you get all the translations. 25 and above, you get translations and videos. Or you can actually, if you just wanted to buy them one by one on Patreon, you can buy each one of these. I've set it at the lowest price, which is $3. So you can just buy these individually if you wanted to. So that's all. I appreciate all of you guys watching. And as always, God bless.